this is the first time I'm hosting such a meeting out of the science part, not chemistry science. This is social science. For me, it's a new experience too. The idea of this discussion panel is, is when we in such a situation of a pandemic, and we never have this possibly in the past 50 years, right? And such a big thing impacted our life. And, our community meet this situation, and it's how we're gonna respond to this. It's such a new thing for us. And we would, since this thing we know, start from China and spread all over the world. And right now, people don't understand how those things started. That's something needed to be investigated. And also the political parts gets in as well. So which make the Asia population right now kind of sadly could be a target for some people. They don't understand the situation. And this panel, we're gonna discuss some issues correlated with this part and how the Asian population in America, our starting point and the difficult part we meet in all the different situations. This is just one of that. If we go back, talk about the history, we can see all the Asian American, how do we struggle in all different situations. And this is one of that. So we have two speakers today. Gonna share their experience and also have a more deep discussion about this part. First one is Stacey, Diane, Dr. Stacey, Diane Litam. I hope I pronounced that right. And so she's assistant professor of counseling education at CSU. So she will have all the introduction of the history of Asia American experience. And also including personal experience. We're gonna have about 20 to 25 minutes discussion. And then the second speaker will be Joyce Huang. She is the Vice President of Community Development at MidTown, Cleveland. So she has very broad interactions with all the Asian population in MidTown, or we call Chinatown over there, which is different as our small campus situation. We mainly interact with students and colleagues. So Joyce gonna have interaction with all different the Asian population over there, and how do they responding to that? Are they treated fairly in this situation? Did they meet any very frustrated situation in this pandemic? Enough said, I'm gonna pass the microphone to Stacey, starts the talk. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for taking time out of your, what day is it? Is it Tuesday? Take time out of your Tuesday to connect more with your Asian peers, to hear about how you can be an ally and how to understand the experiences of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, or AAPI, given the presence of COVID-19 related racial discrimination. So, I think one of the things that I really wanted to talk about today is that we do know that there is a substantially increased rate of race-based discrimination towards AAPI across the nation. So much so that I know the Filipino Mental Health American Society, Chinese, Korean, and even Japanese American societies have done their own kind of in-group trainings with their respective distinct groups, because it's affecting many of our mental health, our wellness, it's affecting our abilities to navigate our daily lives. And, I think one of the things that is most frustrating to me is that this seems to be one of the first times people are talking about discrimination towards AAPI. And in reality, Joyce backed me up on this. This isn't the first time Asian Americans have faced xenophobia in the US. So starting in 1882, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, this is not the first act, the first policy to specifically target any one racial or ethnic group. And for a period of 10 years, Chinese workers were banned from coming to the US to work. We also had the persistence of the yellow peril in the 19th century, which is the false stereotype that Asian Americans, specifically East Asians and Chinese Americans, are dirty, filthy, and somehow unfit for citizenship in the US. So we have a long-standing history of xenophobia that tends to come up anytime there is some instability in infectious disease, and also any kind of instability that interferes with Western trade. Joyce, is there anything you want to add?
Sure. I mean, I think you're covering the bases, and I think it is important to note too that when immigration policies were shifting in the 1920s, there was sort of a quota placed on Asian countries specifically in 1924. So while European immigrants were able to immigrate to the United States, there really was a closure of that. And the Exclusion Act was not lifted until 1944 or 45, right around the time when the United States was entering war with the Japanese. And I might be getting my dates wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, Stacey. So the Chinese Exclusion Act specifically towards the Chinese ethnic group was lifted in the 40s, so not even 100 years ago. And then really, a lot of the civil rights that Asians wanted, so citizenship and naturalization, wasn't really available until I believe it was the 50s. So it's very recent that you could be naturalized as a Chinese American or Asian American. And then a lot of the mass immigration started happening in the 70s and 80s after the Immigration Act was changed in 1965. And so I feel like we kind of are sometimes ahistorical, like we think, oh, you know, there's been so much progress, and you can see that there's a stream of all these Asians immigrating and they seem to be doing well, which we'll dive into later, I think, with the model and minority myth, which coincided very nicely with sort of the narrative about how Asians are, you know, they're fine and they don't need help. And yet this history, like Stacey mentioned, of xenophobia has run deeply in this country, and I think has persisted and arises conveniently in situations when there's instability. So.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you, Joyce. And your dates are spot on, my friend.
Okay,
So yes, as we were discussing the model minority myth, this is the false belief that all Asians, especially East Asian Americans, are successful, hardworking, well-educated, you know, just doing really well in society. And I think that this promotes the invisibility of Asian Americans, who actually are a collective of 40 distinct subgroups, all with very different languages, cultures, colonization histories, values about help-seeking behaviors and religious modalities. And so to say that everyone has this one experience is also to invalidate the real challenges that do exist across our AAPI groups. Now, even though we have 40 distinct subgroups and many Asians are doing well, the gap between Asians that are doing well and Asians in poverty are more disparate compared to any other racial group. So the diversity within our group is wider compared to any other racial or ethnic group. I think it's really important to highlight, because of the model minority myth really posits that because all Asians are doing well, we also don't experience racism, and we also don't experience mental or medical health concerns, but we do because we're human. And so I think that it's important to see us for that and to validate those experiences, because we do also experience racism, and more so as of late.
Yep, I totally agree with that. And I think it's really interesting. I wanted to comment just a little bit about immigration in the greater Cleveland area and what that looks like. So I think, you know, as Stacey referred to, there are groups that are immigrating who have an educational background. And so they're coming from their home country already sort of with a set of privileges of being educated. Although you can argue that once they arrive, they still face quite a bit of discrimination and prejudice based on sort of language or accents and things like that, as well as not being seen as sort of leaders in their field. However, from maybe an educational standpoint, they are arriving with maybe higher degrees. And so you'll see a lot of those Asians settling mostly in the suburbs in the area. And so as an urban planner, that's my background, we study sort of the immigration within the urban areas. And so you see that stratification happening with folks with higher education and maybe more resources settling in the suburbs. But then for the inner city, with the Asia Town neighborhood here, you see mostly working class folks, folks who are not literate in English and sometimes not even literate in their home language. So that proves to be a challenge when it comes to access to resources. In addition to that, there are documentation issues. So when it comes to citizenship status, there are still folks who are undocumented. And I believe in Ohio, 1 out of 7 undocumented persons is of Asian descent, which I think folks are often surprised by, but it's a reality for many people who are sort of in poverty or working class. And so there's a whole set of complications there with regard to COVID, then in terms of who is able to receive the stimulus checks and the other resources. So if you don't have citizenship, or if you weren't employed with a W-9 and other technical things, you can't receive some of those resources. And that's been a challenge for a lot of the residents in our neighborhood. So I guess in terms of one of the topics that we have in our agenda, the current climate of xenophobia, perhaps I can speak a little bit about Asia Town and what we're seeing there. So the Asia Town neighborhood is just across the highway bridge from CSU. So if you can think of Payne Avenue and 30th Street, that's where the new Asia Town begins. It spreads all the way down to sort of East 55th Street along the corridors of Payne Avenue, Superior Avenue, and a portion of St. Clair Avenue. There is an old Chinatown located on Rockwell and East 24th Street. And if you're familiar with that area, you'll know that there's architecture that kind of resembles an older Chinese architecture. And I guess some background on how the Chinatown and Asia Town developed here in Cleveland is that the first Chinese migrants actually came 150 years ago. So this year is the 150th anniversary of the first Chinese Americans in Cleveland, which is a huge celebration. And they first settled in downtown Cleveland. And many people are surprised to hear that because they think that the Asia Town has mostly been around the Payne Avenue area. So from an urban planning history, they were located on, I think it's Huron, where the new Justice Center is, near the Hard Rock Cafe area, behind the Sherwin-Williams headquarters. And so while they first settled there, they were actually, they had to move because their land was taken by eminent domain. And so the city said, there's blight here. And so of course, the blight is always used as a reason to shuffle people around, particularly people of color. So they moved to the Rockwell area, and then the highway came through and divided that neighborhood up. And there were houses that were knocked down and demolished, and they moved across the street to the Payne Avenue area. So, so the neighborhood has seen about a lot of change, particularly in the business and retail. So 40% of their revenue was down, not in March, not in April, but starting back in February, right as the news about COVID was breaking. So even before we were shelter in place or in lockdown, Li Wah, which is one of the biggest restaurants, was already seeing a major decrease in revenue. And that was, we think, related to the fears around, if you're coming to Asia Town, that you might get the virus somehow. And so we've seen that in Chinatowns all across the US, where many are closed and closed permanently. So we are working really hard on the ground with our staff to make sure that we're reaching out to all the restaurants to make sure they have the resources they need through the loan programs and stimulus programs. Many of them are skeptical and unwilling to take on additional debt because I think for restaurant industry, the margin is so low, and also for cultural reasons, taking on debt is often not favorable. So as many of them tend to rely on cash. So the businesses have suffered, and because the businesses are the heartbeat of the neighborhood, therefore the workers who work in the restaurants, who live in the neighborhood, have also suffered because they have, they don't have a job. Residents also have been fearful about walking outside, whether that's due to fears of the virus or fears of attacks. And I can say that actually our staff member, Karis, was actually attacked verbally when she was leaving our office in the month of March and April. Someone called her a racial slur and then spit on her car. And that was extremely painful for her. And it was really difficult for her to actually talk about it. And so incidents like that have been happening across our neighborhood as well as across town for East Asian presenting folks, even if they aren't Chinese American. So it's been a struggle. I think it's been hard to grapple with how to process all of that, with not many resources out there, maybe not many spaces to be able to do so.
Yeah, Joyce, I really appreciate you sharing the history of the Chinese migrants in Cleveland. 150 years is really worth a celebration. And I appreciate too your willingness to connect with our local businesses to make sure they're getting the support they need, especially when it's really hard for many of us to engage in help-seeking behavior because we're often taught and socialized not to cause waves, not to be inconveniences, not to ask for help. I know my dad always told me to be seen, not heard. And so that's something that I continue to challenge myself on as an Asian woman. So to piggyback off of what Joyce mentioned about this increased discrimination and xenophobia in light of COVID-19, we tend to see that the types of discrimination falls into one of three categories, and they often overlap. So the first of which Joyce beautifully elucidated on was that we have this discrimination towards Asian-owned businesses. So people are not frequenting convenience stores, restaurants, or other businesses owned by Asians. We're also seeing an increase of verbal slurs and then also physical assaults and violence. So I actually just got off the phone with a friend of mine the other day who had disclosed that one of his friends had just been murdered in Georgia. This is an Asian woman, was coming home from work. Two white males followed her home and murdered her in her driveway, called her a lot of different racial slurs, and this is still unreported. So keep your eyes open for that. So we do see that this is something that many of us in our communities are experiencing and also really carrying with us in a very painful way. And as Joyce said, it's really tough for us, I think, to find effective ways to get support around this, because one of the challenges with being an Asian person is we often don't do a great job of asking for help. And again, that depends on a couple of different things, including one's acculturation status and one's ethnic identity. So I know it's challenging to make this sweeping generalization, but if I were to make this as simple as I could, ethnic identity consists of two components, the first of which is a sense of belonging to one's ethnic identity, and then also a sense of identifying as a member of that identity. So generally speaking, the stronger one's ethnic identity is, the more resilient they are, and that tends to be a more effective way to mitigate those effects of racial discrimination. The other piece is acculturation, and that is referred to as one's ability to really embody and take on any kind of values, beliefs, or attitudes or behaviors of the majority host culture. So in this case, the US. So Asians who are more acculturated tend to have more Western values. They tend to eat, Western American food, and maybe spend less time with their language, less time engaging in more traditional ethnic identified behaviors. And so what we find in the research is that Asians who are more acculturated or bicultural tend to have better mental health and greater life satisfaction compared to Asians who are less acculturated or not assimilated. So those two things are also going to influence the ways in which someone experiences these moments of racial discrimination, because this really interesting thing happens when people of color, including AAPI, experience racism. We have this thing called attributional ambiguity, where something really crummy happens, and then we're forced to wonder, oh, did that happen because of my racial or ethnic identity? Or am I attributing this to something that is not actually explaining that? So we have this extra kind of cognitive emotional step where we're now forced to engage in emotional resources to resolve this experience. And I think that's something that's worth absolutely validating in your Asian American friends and community members. If something happens, very much validate that as real, and honor whatever feelings or emotions come with that. Being also mindful not to infer or to place any kind of emotion on that if that's not their experience. Anything else anyone wants to add? Joyce, I'm talking a whole lot.
When they meet all the different frustrated situation, one thing is to go ask for help. Is they want to go or they don't want to go. Second is where they're gonna go looking for help. That's another thing. Possibly a lot of people, they don't know where to go to looking for help, right? If they meet the unfair treatment, all those things, discrimination to them, they don't know what to do, which eventually lead to all the kind of a silenced situation.
That's a great question, Ben. And actually, we've been facing that here in Asiatown, not just during the time of COVID, but throughout the time that we've been here in Asiatown. And I think whether that's reporting a crime or reporting a hate crime or harassment, people have been feeling pretty hesitant. And even with sort of the greater Asian American community, there have been, outlets, for example, some organizations nationally have posted websites where you can report hate crimes or harassment. And while folks who perhaps are more acculturated or bicultural are more comfortable reporting those, there are many people who are not, particularly if you are very connected to sort of your home culture. And that's been a huge issue within Asiatown, is encouraging folks to report incidences. And whether it's they don't feel like they're heard or just feeling like, oh, it's not that bad, and sort of shaking it off. That's been a huge challenge. In terms of local public safety, I know that this has been an ongoing issue with the Cleveland police. Many residents not feeling comfortable calling the police, whether that's because of language access or just their relationship with the police is often complicated, and it's scary for many of the residents to talk with people with such authority, and oftentimes have had negative experiences, whether here or in their home country, with law enforcement. And so I think one dynamic too, speaking as an Asian American, and I'm a second generation Asian American, is that oftentimes in trying to find space to discuss these things, I feel pretty safe with some of my Asian American friends, but I think in the larger discourse, there's sort of a downplaying sometimes of saying, well, at least my experience wasn't as bad as this person's, or not as bad as this other racial group. And while there are many kinds of oppression and not all of our oppressions are the same, I think that giving space and acknowledging feelings, as Stacey has mentioned, is really important, so as to not repress and to become even more frustrated. So I've heard it from many people, they're like, well, at least it's not that bad. Well, at least you're still have this and this privilege. And I find that the Oppression Olympics is not very helpful. So just another note to tag onto what Stacey has already shared.
Yes, I agree. I think that's something that if you have Asian American or Asian friends, colleagues, peers, students, and you're having these discussions, I do encourage you to validate those experiences and also to help them put a name and a label to that experience, because there's this really interesting phenomenon that happens where unless we label our experience, it stays invisible. And when experiences stay invisible, that creates a lot of opportunity for people to attribute shame, to carry around this experience and spend a lot of emotional energy on it, but not really know where it's coming from. So encouraging students to put a name and label their experience can be really, really powerful. Now, I really want to encourage you not to create the label for them, because a student might not want to say, I experienced race-based hate. They might just want to say, something really crummy happened to me. And then you validate, yeah, that was really crummy. Because then, you're kind of meeting the student where they are, meeting the person where they are, without creating more anxiety, more fear, more opportunities for shame where it doesn't need to live. So I think that's the one thing, making the invisible visible. The next point that we are going to discuss are those personal experiences. I think Joyce did a really great job bridging us into that, where, yes, I've heard many of my own family members, friends, colleagues do that kind of minimization of experiences, somehow less valid than. And on one hand, I can appreciate how this rationalization can be helpful in alleviating a little bit of anxiety, but it also doesn't do a great job in validating their experiences as real, right? So I think to that, it's just, if that is the response that is working well for them, cool. Let's have that keep going, because we're all kind of living through trauma right now, and trauma experiences can look a little bit different for many of us depending on our own intersecting identity. So if that's what's working right now, then it seems like there's no need to intervene until it stops working and we start to see some challenges, which leads us into those mental health effects of racial discrimination. So you might be asking, okay, well, what am I looking for? How am I going to be able to acknowledge and support a student who's online that I'm not seeing face-to-face all the time, or a family member or a partner who is Asian and might be struggling? So again, keeping in mind that the ethnic identity and acculturation is going to play a part here, many Asian Americans tend to somaticize mental health experiences rather than experiencing traditional Western forms of depression or anxiety. So whereas many individuals who identify as white European individuals might say, I feel sad, I feel frustrated, I feel angry, a lot of us don't have those in our language. And also, we are not likely to report those symptoms. We're more likely to report more somatic issues like headaches, backaches, stomach aches, difficulty sleeping, a change in appetite. I've told this story a million times. My dad, who's an oncologist, specializes in hematology and deals with death and dying on a daily basis. So when my dad is struggling and he's lost a patient that he's really cared about, he won't have dinner with me and say, I feel really sad. He'll say, I'm not hungry, or I've got a tummy ache. I won't say tummy ache, he's a grown man. I've got a stomach ache. My neck hurts. I've got a lot of pain in my shoulders. So I'll notice these different somatic symptoms that tend to present in Asian Americans more so than reports of traditional kind of feelings words. Also keep in mind that if you have an Asian in your life, and they're normally very social and they connect with you, but now suddenly they're too busy, or something's come up and they're canceling Zoom meetings or canceling, FaceTime dates. They're not as available as they were. I would really encourage you to check in on them, because avoidance is often comorbid with trauma. And it's really easy when we're socially distant to engage in that traumatic avoidance. So if you're noticing an Asian in your life is now suddenly a little bit distant or inaccessible, I would really encourage persistent checking in. Even if that's a text that says, hey, I've noticed that you and I haven't connected in some time. I'm worried about you. And it would really mean a lot to me if we could connect. So you're acknowledging that they mean something to you. You're acknowledging that now they're distant, and you're saying, I care about you and I want to be there to support you through this process. Joyce, Vin?
You know, just one quick something when you talk about from the first generation, you know, I'm a neutralized Chinese American, versus like my kids grown up, they were born over here. And so the identity problem and also the way, because they grew up over here, they are westernized and easily. So the way for you guys like you express your emotion, everything will be very different as the first generation. Do you have a comparison with the first generation of Asian American versus the second generation or third generation of American? And how do they express their feeling, everything differently? And how do they treat the different the situation, like a discrimination, anything frustrating? How do they express that? Is a difference over there?
So I think it's always tough, because when we have these seminars, we come here because we want to help. We want to know what to do. We want to have clear actions, get clear results. And unfortunately, just like I tell my students, their least favorite response from me is, well, it depends. And that's true here too. So I actually was born in the Philippines. I moved to the States when I was young. And so my experience of being a foreign-born Asian American will look very different than another foreign-born experience. And so, you know, I really invite each of you to be just mindful of how the Asian in your life experiences the world around them, because the way that we all see the world is going to be a lot different, and it's going to take into account a lot of very diverse intersectional factors. So I guess if I could say something that would be helpful, which I'm sure you're all like, well, when is it going to be? It would be this. If you're noticing a significant change in behavior, that's worth checking in.
Thanks, Stacey. I don't have much to add. I think I don't know any of the data related to first, second, or third generation, although I think that's pretty interesting. Just anecdotally, I know that my own parents who came from Taiwan, it'll be like years later, like literally 10 years later, when they'll casually mention something like, oh yeah, like I experienced this like issue of discrimination, like at my job, or, you know, something like that comes out like way later. And I'm often surprised that they, I think culturally, specifically for like East Asians, and sort of suffering is sort of a part of that mentality of like, of course suffering is going to happen, so I'm here to sort of like grind it out and you know, try to work it off, kind of a thing. And please correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, if that's off base, but I think that is pretty common. Whereas second and third generation, I think there's more of an acknowledgement that racism exists in America and around the world. And so I think there's a lot more discussion, sometimes helpful, sometimes not helpful. And I think the biggest thing that stands out to me in some of our discussions with peers is thinking about how trauma is passed down generationally, and especially when it's not spoken about. And so I think even though my parents weren't speaking about it, I could sense something was wrong. And even myself, like growing up as a second generation person, bicultural person, I knew that something was like not right in the air and the water around me. But I couldn't name it. And so that was something that was particularly challenging for me. It was not until I got to college when there was language around this, words like microaggressions, or just even understanding the history of race in America, where it kind of more clicked. And I was like, okay, I can express sort of where some of these thoughts and feelings are coming from, and maybe some of my parents' experiences that I wasn't really able to place. So.
I really love that contribution, Joyce, and I similarly share those experiences of the influence of kind of socialized intergenerational trauma that often goes unspoken, and that creates a sense of kind of cultural mistrust between East Asians and also white Americans. So many of you have noticed my last name. It's a little bit ethnically ambiguous, Litam. So my great-grandfather actually changed our last name because he had experienced so much Chinese-based racism, and he didn't want his progeny to continue to experience racism themselves. And so he transposed his last name, which was Tom Lee, T-A-M space L-I, to Litam. And he combined it because he thought it sounded more white. And so any Litam is related to me. There's not many of us, they're all in the Philippines. So my own last name is evidence of this kind of systemic racism that exists towards Asians. And so similarly, the messages I received were ones that were about community, but community within an Asian sense, or community within people of color. My dad always said you have to work twice as hard to get half as far as someone within the white community. And that's something that's always stood with me. But the point of this is that these are the messages many of us are receiving, and these are the messages that might keep us from seeking help. So again, if you're noticing that someone that you know is behaving a little bit differently and you're worried, that's worth checking in, because many of us have experienced and have received and have internalized a lot of these messages from early on in our childhood that we continue to hold with us on an unconscious or more conscious level. I just want to briefly go over microaggressions because I know that I glanced over them. I also want to do a quick little pulse check because I know I talk really fast, and I promise I'm not trying to freestyle rap at you, but can you understand what I'm saying? Okay, cool. When I get really excited, I start to talk very quickly, and I know that sometimes it can be challenging to keep up, like I'm the twista of counselor educators. But so microaggressions are these subtle, kind of invisible ways that individuals, typically well-meaning whites, invalidate or offend people of color or individuals with diverse non-dominant identities in ways that we find to be really painful. So this can be anything from saying you speak good English to saying, oh, you're like one of the cool Asians, right? So there's a couple of different specific.
Or you're one of the pretty Asians.
Oh yeah,
You're really good-looking Asians.
Most Asians aren't pretty, but you're a little different, Joyce. Hey, Paula. It's just, these are these different kinds of microaggressions that Asians specifically face. Other ones include perpetual foreigner. So asking, oh, where are you from? When I am in Westlake. The exotic lotus blossom is another one. The yellow peril is, again, we talked about that. That's the discourse that highlights Asians as dirty, filthy, and somehow unworthy of citizenship. And then the model minority, which is really a really challenging discourse to embody, because by saying that this minority group is the model minority creates a false dichotomy, because by having a model minority, that also means that if there are problem minorities, and that's not cool at all, because we shouldn't be putting people against one another. And so really encouraging individuals not to engage in that discourse, because it also perpetuates the myth of meritocracy, which posits that if people just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, you too can be successful like Asians. But that assumes people have boots, and that assumes people have bootstraps, and that is just not the case.
I think that's a very cool, description about, the sensitivity part. I think first generation, second generation, or the third generation has different sensitivities to a lot of discrimination. Like as a first generation one, our sensitivity did not reach that level. A lot of things because of language barrier or whatever, you did not grow up over here. You even did not realize that's discrimination. That's, kind of happened to a lot of this first generation. But the second generation, you grown up over here, you catch that up. You can get that immediately. So that's the difference over there too.
I just want to mirror that. Ben, you're actually spot on, my friend. The current research does suggest that the attribution for racism tends to be different for foreign-born versus people born in the States. So there's a strong positive correlation between how long someone has been in the US and how likely they are to attribute discrimination to their race. So the longer someone has been in the States because they've been born here or they've lived here longer, the more likely we are to attribute discrimination to race compared to someone who's immigrating here. They're less likely to attribute that discrimination to their race.
Yeah, and I will share an anecdote actually. So I grew up in Rochester, New York, in upstate New York, and our community was of Taiwanese folks who had immigrated with an educational background to work in the professional realm. And so there weren't many of us. I think the population of Asian Americans and AAPIs in where I grew up is probably like 2%, maybe similar to Cuyahoga County actually. But so a lot of people, you know, started working right away as they got jobs. And one of my friends' parents, like I think, and even with my parents, I think initially they're kind of like, oh yeah, this is like the American dream. Like we're just gonna do it. And then as they continue living here for years, they're like, oh. And so for example, one of my friend's parents, he found out as he had worked at one of the companies in Rochester for over 25 to 30 years. And he found out that for his position, he was being paid, and let me make sure I get this right. He was getting paid 30% less than others at his same level, but also 10% less than people below him. And so institutionally, this is pretty common with Asian folks all across, and I would say specifically with the first generation, is that there isn't like a true knowledge of sort of how you might be taken advantage of, unfortunately, sadly. And so, you know, situations like that happen all the time where there's like a huge discrepancy in pay. And interestingly, my friend's father did end up taking action. He took legal action, but however was pushed out pushed out of his position and then moved to Taiwan because he couldn't deal with it anymore. So there's just situations like that anecdotally that I can share, but I know data-wise that happens institutionally.
All right, you know, we have 15 minutes left. So we'll leave this 15 minutes for questions and discussion, comments, and experience from our whole audience.
I think I have a question regarding the status of the Asians. One thing about hiring is I noticed that there's an experience with my professor when I was at the University of Houston, and he mentioned he is from China, he's Asian, and at the same time there's an African American hire at the same time, but because African American will be considered as a minority, so even they have hired at the same time, his salary is much less than the other person because they said because of the minority, so they have extra bonus for the hiring. And the question is, when you look at the population of the African American, if they consider as a minority, and you look at the Asians, the percentage is even much less than the African American. So basically they can be considered the minority of the minorities, but we don't have that status. We don't even qualify as the minorities. That's why we are not qualified for the bonus. So I don't know, is there a way to fix these problems? We never consider as a minority, even we have a very low percentage in the population.
Stacey, did you want to address it? I can take a shot and start, and then maybe you can add additional comments. Sure. So Mr. Lam, I think there are maybe a few different ways to define minority. So how you're speaking is purely in terms of population and numbers. And that's certainly one way to define minority, but I think just given the history of race in America, if you look at the history of African Americans in America and think about their experience, particularly as peoples who were, you know, heavily oppressed, taken against their will and enslaved as free labor to build up an economic system that ultimately did not belong to them, as well as the continued discrimination, as well as structural racism that has happened to the African American community over the past 400 years. I think there might be a different definition of minority there. It's not literally the number of people in terms of the population, but I think it is perhaps around the experience of what it means to be someone racialized in America. And I hope I'm making sense and being concrete enough. I don't know specifically about your friend's situation at the University of Houston. Certainly, I think that's something to ponder about in terms of the pay, and I won't get into that at all, really. But I think when it comes to defining terms, I think it's really important to understand sort of that the term minority is really more about experience versus population. And I think minority actually is an unhelpful term because, in fact, by 2040, non-white persons are going to become the majority. And so I personally like to stay away from using the word minority because I think it can be confusing. And I think also in regards to race in America, I think the relationship between the African American community and Asian community is something certainly that we could have a whole other conversation about, just in terms of the relationships there. And certainly I think when it comes to issues around structural racism, this is one area that I feel that we need to continue building solidarity around, as well as fighting anti-Black sentiments. So anything that perpetuates discrimination and structural racism against the African American community, that will continue to hurt the Asian community, because all sort of racial issues that impact Asian people started because white supremacy is based on anti-Blackness. And so I think for me, it's a great debate, I think, in the Asian community, like wanting to stand up and be seen, but also, you know, I think creating solidarity around issues and fighting specifically anti-Blackness is something that I'm particularly interested in. However, that does not justify discrimination against Asians. So I'll leave it there. And if anyone has any additional comments or want to continue the discourse, happy to.
I think that was beautiful. I don't have much to add except Dr. Lam, I stand with you and I can appreciate how frustrating that must have been. I hope that you are feeling much more at home at Cleveland State here with us. And, you know, as Joyce mentioned, I also avoid the usage of the term minority, racial minority, ethnic minority, sexual minority, gender minority, because there's nothing minor about us. We are whole humans. And so I prefer people of color or BIPOC or people with non-dominant sexual or gender identities.
And other questions? You know, I like what, you know, Stacey just addressed. Minority, for me, you know, maybe for Asian America, our first step is to make us American. We are American, right? That's the thing we are on the first step. And a lot of time, they just do not consider you are American. That's the thing even bigger. And we just to be common, we are part of America, we are American. So we don't need to be, you know, give a name, oh, you are Chinese American. We are American. That's the most important thing. And that's the first step. We need to move that and solve that issue. So then, you know, I think that's even bigger than the minority issue.
I just had a question. I appreciate this dialogue a great deal. This has been wonderful. It's helpful. And but I wonder if any of you get overwhelmed with despair when you see displays of ignorance paraded proudly as some sort of heritage.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
if you spend a lot of time at university and then you go to Lowe's to buy some wood, you're dealing with different demographics and thinking. And I'm like, I get so aggravated and frustrated sometimes. And I know that dialogues like this remind us that, you know, many people are thinking the same thoughts and we've got to get out there. But wow, it seems like an uphill slog. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I can start. So I actually yesterday, while deep in the Lit Review, was on the World Health Organization website and was shocked to find that the background photo for coronavirus was a picture of a sneezing Asian woman. So I had a moment and I emailed the WHO, and then I Instagrammed them, and then I tweeted them, and then I had my friends socially media attack them or invite change. But yes, I also you know, have experienced these moments of discrimination. I've had people, this is, you know, back in March or April, people at the gym tell me to take my Kung Flu back to Wuhan, or have called me Ching Chong, told me to go eat a bat, you know, all the things, right? One of my favorite people at Cleveland State is in the counseling psych program. You might know her. Her name is Dr. Hogue, Ingrid Hogue. And one of the things that she says to me that I carry so deeply in my heart that I found to be really helpful in navigating these experiences of oppression is she always says, Stacey, is this a hill you want to die on? And it helps me to kind of conceptualize, well, what is in my realm of control and what can I not control? So I cannot control how people treat me, what they say, what they do, but I am in control of my actions and my response and how I conceptualize my experience. So what's within my control is to use all of my energy right now to put towards research, to put towards advocacy, to speak on national platforms about promoting AAPI mental health and wellness, and to do all the things that I can do and am doing to perpetuate better quality of care, more culturally sensitive strategies for AAPI, and more psychoeducation about challenging historical xenophobia.
Thank you, Stacey. I just want to add to that really quickly. I think, I know for me, I often feel like I'm despairing, but I went through this really great retreat recently that was for people of color sort of fighting structural racism, which is very overwhelming and feels often very negative because it's a constant fight. And this seminar, which was led by people who have been activists for generations, they were really encouraging us, like, you know, instead of sort of being contractive and sort of negative and feeling like constantly sort of fight or flight, which is a mentality that is triggered when we're constantly faced with fear or trauma, is to kind of be more expansive and more soul focused and thinking about how can we kind of create a new reality. And I know that feels very out there, but I think that's something that I've been exploring recently, is really thinking about mindfulness and conscientiousness, and sort of when I find myself closing up, to think about, you know, what would happen if I could be like my 100% authentic self, to be mindful of who I am and my locus of control, and to begin creating a new reality, which I hope that many of us can do together, because we definitely need a new reality. And I'll leave it at that.
Hi, this is Ronnie, Dr. Dunn. I want to first apologize for being late. I was in another Zoom meeting that ironically, unfortunately, the name of is Minority Health Strike Force, trying to deal with this, the impact of COVID at the state level in communities of color. But so I do apologize, but I want to first thank and commend both Stacey and Joyce. The information that you've shared that I've gotten during the short period of time I've been on has been very insightful, and I just really want to commend you in the work that you're doing, as well as the Diversity Council for putting on this forum. I would like to ask, one, is it recorded? And if so, if you would mind sharing it, I would love to post it on the division's website to use as a resource to help educate the broader community. And once again, I just want to thank you and commend you, and hopefully this will be the first of many such dialogues and forums going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. It has been recorded, so with the presenters and moderators' approval, yes, we'll send that out to you unless anybody has something that they are not comfortable sharing.
Okay, excellent.
May I ask a quick question of the panel? I have a Chinese student that lives with me, and since the quarantine started, he is rarely out of his room. He's in high school. But my question is, how do you connect better with him? We had a pretty decent dialogue before all of this started, but I have no idea what else I should do for him. I don't know if his family is kind of recommending that he quarantine or that he stay away from us. I'm not really sure what it is, and I don't know what I could do to help him better.
So, Allison, thank you for your question, and I appreciate your desire to check in with your student because you've noticed that there is this change. It sounds like you two have had a pretty good relationship before this, and we're having some healthy dialogue. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we've only had him since January. He came from a boarding school in Maine, but he has attended school with my sons, and it was pretty good when it first started. But it quickly, you know, obviously he's only been in school for 2 months here in Ohio, and then this quarantine hit, so.
Yeah. Have you asked him how he's doing?
We have. He always kind of puts it off as everything's fine. You know, I ask him how his family is. Even starting up, I was asking him, are you fearful of your friends at home? And he's not really been one to open up much about it. I don't know.
So I had an idea, you know, and this is just kind of my own thought, not knowing the person and trusting that you have a strong relationship. Asians love food. I'm wondering what might happen if you, instead of focusing on his emotional experience, asked him, hey, you know, I really want to try a new dish. I found a couple different recipes on Pinterest. I'm wondering if there's one that you want to try with me and we can cook dinner together.
Okay.
That might be a nice way for him to connect with home, connect with his roots, and get a little bit of interaction. It's not so dialogue based. Joyce, what do you think?
I 100%, I was thinking like food, 100%.
I
think often, yeah, I mean, I think often too, and this is my experience as a second generation with parents who came from Taiwan was, you know, often there wasn't a lot of expression around how you're doing, how you're feeling, but the main love language is really about service and sort of personal service, maybe even at the sacrifice of your time or resources or whatever. And so I think definitely that is an activity that would be really great. Even if it's like, oh, I popped by one of the Asian stores, which I can give recommendations for. I got some snacks. Like, I'll just leave them outside your door and you can eat them whenever you want.
Get him some ramyeon and haga. He's going to be in hell.
We do take him to a store that, you know, where he can pick what he wants. But yeah, we're just looking for ideas just to try to connect better with him, just so that, you know.
Yeah, you gotta go food, girlfriend. You gotta feed that man. He's gonna.
I'm big into American food, just a little bit, but.
But I think it's actually a great opportunity to connect with some of the AAPI owned restaurants, especially downtown. There's phenomenal restaurants that are both open and hurting for business. So I go get like an exorbitant amount of carry out and he'll come out, I bet.
He will come out.
He will come out. He's going to smell it. He's going to sneak
Just get to
outside.
do it.
And
Salt baked squid. I mean, come
Oh.
on. So good. So good.
yes.
Maybe try the Vietnamese noodles.
Yeah. It's a
Ooh.
all
All of it. Just get him one of everything.
All the
It all
food.
heats up well.
It
He
does.
doesn't ever like, if it's not eaten within 3 hours, he never eats it again. That's something different that doesn't happen in our family usually, so.
Yeah, I think that food is the way to go. Either getting something in support of a local restaurant or offering to cook something with him that maybe he really feels connected to.
Okay, thank you.
I will give a plug right now. So we actually just released our website for Asiatown through MidTown Cleveland. And if you go to asiatowncleveland.org, you will find the complete list of restaurants as well as their new modified COVID hours. And I guarantee that all the restaurants in Asiatown as well as the grocery stores, because a lot of Asian countries are used to pandemics, unfortunately, sadly, they're like on top of their game around safety. So all of them have adjusted how they do takeout. All of them have like glass doors with like little boxes where they pass through the food with like pens that they've sanitized and gloves for you to use. And so it's just a wonderful opportunity to support Asiatown businesses. Only 20% of them were open during COVID, and now some of them are trying to open again. And so there's supporting them could definitely be a huge boost to the neighborhood.
Hi, Bin Shu, do you know the Provo communicate with CASA? They are going to create that like CSU support group for the Asian Americans equality, that thing. Have you heard of anything about that?
I think Chen is trying to organize that one. Is still in the middle, not a full like a function yet.
Okay, but it seems we don't have enough kind of propaganda about the Chinese, those things in and out of the university. For example, every Americans, they are familiar with the African Americans. They treat them as slaves, so they know that's wrong. So that's why right now they want to do something to fix the problem. But it seems that they have nothing know about the Chinese. It seems they own the Chinese nothing. All they know is that the Chinese bring the virus to the America. That's all they know. That's why we don't have enough kind of propaganda about what are the contributions of the Chinese in America. Even within CSU, particularly those undergrad students, they don't know why you hire those Asian professors, why you don't hire the Americans. That's my impression. You have probably the first time they said, okay, you have a different accent. I don't understand anything you're talking about. All these things came from those undergrads. For those who are mature, of course, they understand what's going on. But it seems that we haven't done enough things about what the Chinese or Asians they did for the community, society, or the university. All those things. I think they are missing that point of this one.
I think that comes from also part of our community, and we did not really not like the African American community in the long run. How do they fight their rights? It's a long history. If you read their whole African American community, how do they fight in the past 100 years, voting, everything, right? And so, but for the Chinese community, I don't possibly because of our culture, we do not participate in the politics too much, and we do not know how to really put our contribution in a better platform to show that we are part of the country, and from a raw way building that starting point, and how our whole Chinese community contributed to the economic growth of the whole country, even for the whole growth of the country. Because build the raw way from east to west is a big contribution to the country development. Those part of history is there, but now really like put in a big way to show that. So that's the part of a community, our community. We have to think about how if we want to step up with the first step to make, we don't need to have an identity problem. We are American. So that's the step we need to step up and to show that to the whole country, and to make people realize we are part of that. And that's the part is missing. Any other questions?
This is Terry. I just want to make a quick comment, and I'm not sure if others had the opportunity to view it, but I know PBS this month started their Asian American preview, which, if you have the opportunity, is a great documentary.
Yep.
It tells a lot about the history, and just a very good watch. It's pretty long, but you can break it up in chunks. So if you're interested, I think it would be a great asset to those people online.
Mm-hmm. I have to agree with that. And it is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And so there are opportunities, I think many organizations, both in social media and also, well, I guess it's all virtual now. There are many ways to celebrate. I think definitely there could be more organizing in the Asian American community around, being more vocal, both about our contributions and also for our rights. I think also that there's a lot of work to be done in advocacy for those in our community who are the most invisible as well. So as Stacey mentioned, those who are the most sort of like impoverished class-wise, immigration-wise, citizenship status-wise, as well as organizing around sort of how we can be more visible across media, both sort of mainstream media, but also other forms of media, and like movies and things like that. So whose narratives are being told and whose stories, and with what nuance, right? Not everyone lives the Joy Luck Club. I also think, though, that while that is part of our responsibility, it's also not our responsibility to prove ourselves to people who are bigoted and who cannot change their frame of reference. I just think the burden should not be placed on people of color specifically to pretend, like, to prove that we're like the most loyal and good American. There's no excuse for other people's ignorance, I should say. So that's kind of the flip side of that. Yeah. Well
said, Joyce. We are over 11 minutes. I'm gonna pass back to Sarah and the very good, great discussion. And let's give a round of applause to Joyce and Stacey.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was more than we had hoped for. So we appreciate all your time, and we will make some resources available on the Dean's Diversity website, and make the recording available. So go take a look, and if you missed the beginning, you can catch right up. Thank you very much. I just want to
take a moment to thank the Dean's Diversity Council for your hard work. I know you put in so much effort to get the topic right from the start, and all of you were engaged with that work. And a special thanks to both Stacey, Joyce, and Ben. Thank you for your words today. And I think, as I said right in the beginning, I think this is going to be the first step in a series that we would like to continue this dialogue, both within the college as well as across campus. And, I think this was such a learning experience today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks
Thank
for,
you.
thanks for attending.
Be
everyone.
healthy.
Bye.